helped stop the Australian arrest of Thomas Jefferson. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hello, John.
Hello, sir.
Wow, we're going in a different direction now, aren't we?
We are going in a very different direction. This year, 2020, has been a quite successful year in the context that we stopped the cash ban. That was what we discussed in our last show. So we defended the right to use legal tender without criminal sanction from the federal government. Now we go on to a very new battle, which is coming up. And we have a committee in federal parliament, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. And last week they started an inquiry into extremist movements and radicalisation in Australia. And submissions are due in I think the 12th of February. And so there is a very fundamental question that this inquiry, I think, has to address, and we'll get into this in a second. But the question is that when we have a runaway tyrannical government, do we have the right to rebel or to revolt, in order to defend our rights? Because under Australian law, as we speak, any form of violence is illegal. Any discussion of violence against the government is subject to surveillance. And there was a example only last week where an 18-year-old person in Albury, New South Wales, posted certain comments about violence against the government, and the New South Wales police arrested this person on the basis of an abundance of caution. Not that there was a concrete conspiracy to commit violence or anything like that. It's like, don't talk about it, you can't do it. And obviously there has been a long tradition in England, as well as in the United States, about using violence against the sovereign, against the government, when you get a government that is basically out of control.
So there's a couple of intersecting things here, isn't there? The first is, what is the definition of extremism and all of those sorts of things, and who defines what is extremist?
Yes.
Right. And then the second is, what are the options for society if, in fact, the extremism lever goes one way or the other way, and the government is driving it?
Indeed. So why don't we put the website up for people to have a look at? And now I've started to work on a very long submission, and I'm going to really try to make a go of this. But the first question is, how did this inquiry come about? Peter Dutton, as the Minister for Home Affairs, has written to the committee and said, can you do an inquiry into extremist movements and radicalisation in Australia? And so since 9/11, radicalisation and extremism has been around Islamic extremism and radicalisation. But one of the things that's been catching the attention of policymakers is that there's been a so-called explosion in what they call as far-right extremism for the last 4 years. Now, back in 2016, ASIO's counter-terrorism caseload, looking at far-right extremism, was about 10%. Only last month they testified to Parliament saying it's between 30 to 40%. So they're saying that there's been a huge explosion. And when it comes to Islamic terrorism or extremism, they say that it's concentrated in Sydney and Melbourne. Whereas when it comes to far-right extremism, it's typically white Australians, young, spread across the country, driven by social media. So that's what is driving that whole subject. And I should say that the two key pieces of legislation I've been able to find which really try to address this issue is, so you have the ASIO Act, which talks about surveillance, and it talks about security, and it talks about politically motivated violence. And then you have the Criminal Code Act, which has a whole host of specific crimes defined in the law around treason, treachery, the urging of violence against the Commonwealth or the Constitution or the government, etc., and a few things like that. So I've started to sort of map out in terms of what all that means.
Right. So what is extremism And radicalisation, then, what does it mean?
Well, so basically the way the law is defined, from what I can see at the moment is, and so I will start to have a bit of a look at state law. So I think some of the state parliaments have defined things under state law, but federal law basically. Anything that is of a violent nature against the government, that is extreme, that is radical. Now, when it comes to so-called far right or far left, there is no specific definition that I can find, whether it's in the law or whether it's in any operational documents by, say, the ASIO or the Australian Federal Police. So there's a bit of vagueness about, well, what do you mean by far right extremism? What is far right versus far left? Because for example, some people may say neo-Nazis is far right, and yet an objective analysis of the Nazis they were a socialist party, so they're of a member of the left. So you can get into semantics about, well, what does it all mean? But basically they're saying that if you have a grievance with public policy, there is a non-violent mechanism to go through. And we did that with the cash ban. Yep. So you can go through Parliament, so you can petition your parliamentarian, you can participate in the parliamentary process, you can stand for Parliament if you wish, you can engage in civic discussion through the media or through public meetings, etc. Or if it requires a situation, you can go through the courts. So that is all inbound. But once you start to talk about any form of violence, that's out of bound.
Right. So it is fundamentally about behaviour, and particularly violent behaviour, rather than expressing particular views or not expressing those views.
Yeah. So it's about behaviour, but the expression of that behaviour as well.
Right.
So for example, it would be unacceptable if we said, had the Parliament passed the cash ban, we were going to take up arms and cause a revolution. That would have been unacceptable to even discuss the proposition of violence against in terms of the government.
Right.
But obviously, so how does this tie into Thomas Jefferson? So going back to 1776, there was a very key statement that he had because he wrote the Declaration of Independence, and for those audience members who don't know, Thomas Jefferson was America's third president. First George Washington, then John Adams, then Thomas Jefferson. So I want to bring up our first slide, and this is a key paragraph from the Declaration of Independence. I'm not going to read the whole thing. People can have a bit of a read of it, but I just want to read the highlighted part, which is, and this I think is the key sentence, which is that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government. What are those ends? So earlier in the quote, he says that the core function of government is to protect life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, this is drawn from the English philosopher Locke, who talked about life, liberty, and property, but they changed the property angle into the pursuit of happiness. Now, this sentence by Jefferson is technically illegal under Australian law at the moment, and if Jefferson would be alive today, saying this sentence, he would be subject to ASIO surveillance, and he could potentially be most likely he would be arrested. But in terms of the government, now it is true to say that when he made this statement, he risked being arrested and killed by the British because he in the Continental Congress was engaging in treason by declaring independence. Although they outside of Parliament and the King, they did have quite a bit of public support for in terms of their position. I call this statement I call it the Jefferson Doctrine, and so my submission to the committee of this inquiry is to say that the Jefferson Doctrine, as it is expressed in this quote, should be accepted as a right of Australians. That if the government got out of control, we have the right to alter or abolish the government and to institute new government. So I should say that when I say this, in the American context, this was the last option. They had attempted to petition the Parliament, petition King George III, and they were not getting any redress to the grievances that they had. And they said, well, given that we continue to petition over a number of years, they're not listening, we have no option but to go our own way, because the more they try to resist, the more aggressive the British in the colonies became around taxation and laws and the use of tactics on the ground, and there were massacres, etc., etc. Now, the other key thing I want to raise, Martin, is, so when I talk about that this is the last resort, there's actually a very important quote from John Adams, who was the second president of the United States, who actually talked about the prerequisites for when you would actually use this sort of language of altering or abolishing government. So I want to bring up this second slide, and so I found this from one of the writings of John Adams. So, quote, "When we speak of a tyrant, they may be lawfully be dethroned by the people. We do not mean by the word people the vile populace or rabble of the country, nor the cabal of a small number of factious persons, but the greater and more judicious part of the subjects of all ranks. Besides, the tyranny must be notorious and evidently clear as to leave nobody any room to doubt of it." So basically saying it's got to be so obvious that you're getting a broad cross section of the population, from professionals to working class people to old people, etc. That they feel that something is so wrong, that they need to rebel, and in terms of they need to do something with the government. And I should say that when you look at where this sort of notion has been implemented in the course of the history of English-speaking people, I mean, we're going back to 1215 with Magna Carta, the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, the English Civil War, the American Revolution, and I would even say Ballarat in 1854 in Victoria. And I can't remember if it was this year or last year. We actually did a show about Eureka, and we talked about the importance of what that rebellion against the Victorian government meant in terms of establishing a set of political rights in Victoria, but also establishing the secret ballot, which is now the gold standard for democratic elections.
Right. But I guess the question, John, I've got is this basically saying there are legal processes, right? So, you can sort of go to elections and those sorts of things and elect a new government, and that's all okay. But if that process is unable to achieve the change that the populace wants, there's an alternative route.
Yes. So that is what Jefferson lays out. There is an alternative route.
Yep.
Commonwealth law says there
isn't. You can't do it.
Exactly.
Yes. Yep.
Exactly. So I want to just bring up slide 3 because the core question of this inquiry, to my mind, is, and I don't think this is where Parliament is thinking, but to my mind, I think this is critical. Is what are the Australian people to do when tyrannical government arrives and all political, civic, and judicial processes have been exhausted?
Right.
Because now, look, maybe we'll do a show following up, but there was a difference of opinion between the English philosopher Hobbes, who basically said that, in his view, the sovereign, the English king, was infallible. He was perfect because he was ordained by God. Therefore, the English people had no right to rebel. Whereas Locke says, no, the sovereign is fallible. And obviously, one wrote before the Civil War, and one wrote after the Civil War. And obviously, if you wrote after the Civil War, you had a very good evidentiary base to say that Charles I was fallible, and therefore, if the king or queen is imperfect, you have the right to rebel if the king or queen if they go out of control. And obviously, in terms of our situation, I mean, we do have. We have the Queen, we have the Queen's representative, the Governor General, but then we have the executive government, and that's the Prime Minister, and in terms of the ministers. So I think this is a core fundamental question about the rights of the people when things get out of control.
Yep.
Martin, so one question I have for you is, because you grew up in England with all this rich history of Magna Carta all the way up to when you were born in the 20th century, when you hear this argument put forward by Jefferson and Locke and others about that there needs to be a check on government, because government and monarchs have a tendency to want to increase their power, and you know, there are points, sometime maybe once a century, where that power or that lust for power gets out of control. So when you were growing up in England, to what extent did you learn about the whether the Magna Carta, or in terms of the English Civil War, and were you sort of told that you have a natural right as an Englishman, that if the monarch or Parliament got out of control, you had a historical obligation, given what the generations before you had done, in order to defend the rights for you, your family, and for your community?
So it's quite interesting because, there was quite a lot of history taught in school, right? So, the Peasants' Revolt, the Magna Carta, all of that sort of stuff. But a lot of it opposed Parliament to the sovereign, right? And basically the argument was, you can't trust the sovereign because the sovereign has ultimate power, but Parliament is the check and the balance. And so it's Parliament that actually is preeminent when it comes to the rights and also the freedoms of individuals. That's how it was definitely taught. Right?
So if the Parliament ever got out of control, separate to the palace, was there anything sort of taught to people?
So effectively, the argument was that the Parliament, with all its checks and balances and the two houses and everything else, and the election processes, basically allows it to always be there and always be driving, if you like, the interest. And there was always an interesting debate. Well, hang on a moment, doesn't the sovereign give Parliament the right to actually rule, as it were, in terms of laws and things? But that was always one of those really weird circular arguments, because on one hand you're saying, well, the sovereign, gives the Prime Minister the right to form a government, etc., etc., but on the other hand, Parliament is also there as a check and a balance on the sovereign.
Yes.
Right? But I can tell you that people got very antsy about this, right, in terms of, some of the discussions we used to have at school, and I'd also say that there was almost no discussion of American history and American politics, right? I mean, there was the Boston Tea Party, right, and the Mayflower in 1620, right, and that was about it, right? And then from then on, the position was, the US, they were a law unto themselves, different system, not the same as we got here in Britain, right? And we know better than they, sort of thing, of how it used to come through.
So the interesting thing that I'm hearing from you is that the glory of Britain was taught, but the failures of Britain were basically ignored.
Exactly.
In terms
papered over completely. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes. Just like the slave trade, right, was never really discussed. In reality, it was always, there were a few people unfortunately shipped between countries, but actually this was an economically very powerful and critical for the future success of the, of the nation. So again, it was very myopically presented.
Okay. Now, one of the things that Locke talked about in his writings was the social contract between the people, between the sovereign, etc. So. Although you talked about how Parliament is the checker on the sovereign, were you ever taught in school, or even going through university at Oxford, about a social contract? And if that social contract was to break in the UK, you have rights and obligations to remedy that break in the social contract?
Well, to an extent at Oxford, I did a lot of philosophy at Oxford, of course, moral philosophy was about where is good and where is evil, and how you define good and evil, and is it absolute or is it relative, and who effectively defines right and wrong, right? And basically the argument was, well, that's actually very complicated and there's no simple straightforward right and wrong answer as to what is right and what is wrong, so it depends, right? First point. The second one was that in terms of the whole concept of what happens if the parliamentary system fails, right? And I guess you could cite Guy Fawkes and blowing up the Houses of Parliament and that sort of stuff as extreme. That was always regarded as completely beyond the pale and should never be allowed to happen. And so basically the assumption was that violence should never be actually seen as a legitimate approach to dealing with moral issues, issues of right and wrong, good and evil. Right. In other words, there had to be alternative mechanisms and ways. And of course, the issue there was that then you actually said, well, hang on a month, what about the Second World War? Because there was violence there, was that right or was that wrong? And then you get into really interesting and complex discussions about, well, when is it moral to exert violence, right? What define evil, define good. And again, you start seeing that actually there's a lot of relativity in that as well.
So that's very interesting. So whereas I'm saying to you that Locke and Jefferson had a very black and white view, you're taught a very grey view.
Absolutely, yes. Typical Oxford, right?
Typical Oxford.
yeah. I mean, there were always these shades of grey. It depends, and you can make the argument one way or the other way, and we should be cautious and careful. I mean, that is fundamentally the way that a lot of people, I think, would see it. By the way, I should also add that, of course, there was this basic innate view amongst many at Oxford, not me personally, that somehow, the British Empire was still there and it was still, the perfect example of how society should be. So that was still very strongly entrenched when I was there, despite all the evidence to the contrary.
And you were in Oxford which year?
Let me think. 76 to 80 and 80 to 82.
So late 70s, early 80s.
Correct.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, the other key thing that I just want to bring to the audience's attention, because this is where I think Parliament is going to completely fail. So even before we have the inquiry, I know exactly what this inquiry is going to say. The inquiry is going to say four things. One is, in order to deal with extremism, we need to have more laws.
Yep.
More criminal sanctions. We need to have more surveillance by ASIO, so we need more domestic spying, whether that's electronic or human intelligence, whatever. We need to crack down on people saying certain things on social media, and we need more spending on de-radicalisation programs. That's sort of the approach that we have at the moment. Now, we do have a terror list, and that terror list is mainly around Islamic terrorist groups. There is a recommendation around having some non-Islamic groups in Australia being listed as a terror group. One of the things, so there is a academic study that I just found yesterday, which has been put out by Macquarie University, and it talks about right-wing extremism in Australia, or particularly New South Wales. And one of the sort of predicates it talks about is these people have their own conspiracy theories, and they talk amongst themselves in sort of they talk about things which are not accepted by the mainstream. And I'm looking at this thinking, hang on, but you and I on a regular basis, now we focus on an area of expertise around economics and banking, but and obviously we don't go into sort of extreme rhetoric around violence or anything like that, but there has to be any attempt to say that accept the official narrative, otherwise you're extreme, otherwise you're dangerous. You can't talk on social media because, and we've said this previously, our views on the cash ban, on bail-in, on a whole host of subjects have not been allowed to be fully aired in the mainstream media because it's the counter the establishment narrative. And if people say, well, these guys are non-mainstream, and because of that they're too extreme, they can't have an opportunity to voice their opinion. Well, how do you actually start to resolve some of these grievances in terms of that some people may have? Because now so that's what I think the inquiry is going to say. Now, the key point I want to make is that so they will say we've had an explosion of extremism and radicalisation among young white Australians in the last 4 years. Now, why could that happen? My argument is and this is supported by the data, there has been a collapse in trust and confidence in Parliament, in the politicians, in institutions in Australia. And there's a survey by the ANU called the Australian Election Survey, and they've got a couple of very interesting statistics. So this was last year's data. They found that satisfaction with Australian democracy was at 59%, the lowest since the 1970s when we had the crisis with Whitlam. Trust in the federal government was at the lowest level ever at only 25%. So only 1 in 4 people trust the federal government. This was last year. 56% of Australians believe that the federal government is run for a few big interests, while only 12% believe that the government is run for all the people, and 21% of Australians do not align with any political party. And look, this last one I found quite fascinating, because you think to yourself, when you go vote in the Senate, you've got a tablecloth of 20 options. And this survey said 1 in 5 Australians says of these 20 options in the Senate, not one of them represents my concerns and my grievances. That's a very dangerous position for a political system in terms of to be in. And I should say, so this is Australian data, but when you look at the OECD had a report out last year and said that across the OECD, there's a collapse in trust. So only 45% of people across the OECD trust their national government, and only 59% of people trust their judiciary. So this is not just a specific Australia phenomena. This is an international phenomena. And my key issue is what some of the literature on extremism and radicalisation is missing is if the politicians are not doing their job. We've seen enormous amounts of scandals, financial, economic, etc. Huge numbers of scandals. Public policy is going in the wrong direction. The public policy outcomes are going in the wrong direction. And we could point to housing. It's too hard to get housing. The cost of living index that you run, financial confidence, mortgage stress. There's a whole bunch of things that you can practically say people don't feel happy at the moment about their life, their circumstances. Obviously, COVID-19 has been a tumultuous year for a lot of people, and people just don't trust the institutions that are supposed to resolve these grievances. And so, if people think my life is crap, the people who are supposed to make my life better are not doing a good job. To me, it would be natural that you would have a subset of this population that would start to talk, not perform violent acts, but at least to talk in violent terms. Now, so one of my core arguments in my submission will be is don't look for some band-aid solution around more laws, more spending, more surveillance. If you're going to resolve this issue of extremism and radicalisation, you need to rebuild trust with the people, and you need to start doing the people's business, whether about the economy or about a whole host of issues. So that, I think, is a key message that I want to impart on the committee, and I'm going to have a very direct and blunt way that I'm going to make that point. But that's, I think, a very important point, because ultimately, and whether it's about Magna Carta, English Civil War, American Revolution, Ballarat, and a few other examples, is what drives people to take up arms. It's when the political system becomes non-responsive. So when there are grievances that a lot of people are feeling, are hurting, and there's outrage, and no one is listening, and no one's responding to those grievances, that's when people feel compelled to go that one step further. And I think what we're seeing at the moment, and what I would think that has happened with COVID-19 and the response and the lockdown, is you've got a lot of politicians who have a lot of money because of these taxpayer generous salaries, who have been, I think, tone deaf about the impact of their policies, and yet the people on the receiving end have just been told to suck it up. And for some people, that has not been acceptable. And one of the elements of the terms of reference is so-called extremist groups are taking advantage of COVID-19. Well, maybe COVID-19 and the response to COVID-19 has just exacerbated a whole host of feelings that people have had for the last 4 years.
Yeah, and it seems to me, John, that if the easy, lazy response is to typecast those sort of concerns and objections as, fake news or, other stuff that shouldn't be allowed to be spoken about, right? And they'll accuse social media as being the mechanism which is creating all of this unease, right? It's actually missing the point, which is your critical point. There's a reason why this is happening at this stage, and it's the lack of performance of Parliament itself, and it's a lack of alignment to the interests of ordinary Australians, right? And the lack of awareness that they have to what the real issues are relative to ordinary people.
Indeed. So like I said, I've been only working on this for about a week. So far I've got about 10,000 words. And look, it's going to be a very substantial document I'm preparing. But basically, I'm saying do a better job. Restore trust. Get on top of a whole host of scandals and policy issues that the Parliament needs to address. But on the other hand, recognise that even under Queen Elizabeth, there is a right which has been acknowledged by English philosophers for centuries, which you have extinguished in the law at the moment, that needs to be re-established in one form or another. If they somehow declared that the Jefferson Doctrine was on the table, what does that mean in practical sense? I mean, that's a second question. Yes. But the key issue is that Locke, is Jefferson, is that applicable still today? Is there a social contract? Do people have the right to alter or abolish the government if you get a tyrannical runaway sovereign, a runaway tyrannical parliament? That, I believe, is the right that we have as Australians because of the sacrifices that ordinary English people made for the last 800 years, and that's what I'll be fighting for over the next 2 months.
Sounds like that's the interest of the people, John.
I am trying.
Thank you once again. Martin North, John Adams, the interest of people. We'll see you next time.